Look inside a human skull, and you will find the most complicated physical object that we currently know about in the entire universe. And for thousands of years, long before we had MRI machines or clinical trials, humans have been trying to map out exactly how that complex machinery works. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle pondered the exact location of human consciousness and concluded that it lived entirely in the heart. He was, of course, completely wrong. 2,000 years ago, Chinese rulers took a much more practical approach, conducting the world's first psychological exams by requiring public officials to take personality and intelligence tests. And in the late 800s, the Persian doctor Raziz took early clinical steps by describing mental illness and treating patients in what was essentially an early psych ward in a Baghdad hospital. These ancient societies possessed a deep curiosity about the mind and even developed early clinical applications. But they lacked a rigid, empirical framework to turn those raw observations into a verifiable science. The word psychology itself actually comes from the Latin phrase for the study of the soul. But to transition from philosophical pondering into a formal, hard science like chemistry or physics, researchers need empirical, measurable data. This conceptual diagram illustrates the central paradox preventing that evolution. The scientific method requires clear observation to generate data, but you cannot directly observe an abstract thought, a memory, or a feeling. The mind acts as a black box. The entire history of modern psychology is defined by how different pioneers attempted to solve this exact measurement problem. The first major attempt to legitimize the field happened in 1879, when German physician Wilhelm Wundt set up the very first formal psychology laboratory. Wundt and his student Edward Bradford Titchener developed an approach called structuralism. They argued that if a chemist could break down physical matter into simple elements, they should be able to break down the human brain into its base structures. Their primary methodology relied on introspection. They would ask patients to look inward and report their subjective emotional responses to sensory stimuli, like watching a sunset or smelling coffee. The problem with this approach is that inner thoughts cannot be independently verified by an outside researcher. One person's internal feeling is entirely different from another's. Treating the invisible mind as if it were observable chemistry proved to be entirely too subjective, rendering structuralism a scientific dead end. Around the same time, the American physician and philosopher William James executed a conceptual pivot. He stopped worrying about the structure of thoughts and started focusing on the function of behavior. This approach, called functionalism, bypassed the strict observability problem by utilizing Darwinian evolution. James looked at how specific physical behaviors adapt and are conserved to ensure survival. Then came Sigmund Freud, who complicated the observability problem even further by theorizing the existence of an entirely hidden layer of the mind. The radical core of psychoanalysis was the idea that human behavior is heavily dictated by unconscious motives, mental processes that our own conscious minds cannot access or see. To observe this unobservable space, Freud developed unique therapeutic techniques. He used dream analysis and free association, encouraging patients to talk continuously to coax repressed, hidden truths up to the surface. Prior to this, people with mental illnesses were frequently shackled to beds in sanitariums. Psychoanalysis proved that disorders could be healed through self-discovery and talk therapy. But because Freud focused on the invisible unconscious, taking empirical, laboratory-style measurements remained nearly impossible. By the first half of the 20th century, there was a fierce reaction against Freud's invisible theories. Scientists demanded hard, irrefutable data. Heavy hitters like B.F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov, and John B. Watson argued that if psychology was going to be taken seriously as a science, it had to focus strictly on observable actions. This triggered the era of behaviorism. Their methodology involved controlling environments completely, putting rats, pigeons, and even babies into isolated boxes and conditioning them to perform physical, repeatable responses. Behaviorism effectively solved the observability problem by simply refusing to acknowledge the invisible inner workings of the mind altogether. Ultimately, these historical pioneers were all partially right, and they were all partially wrong about how to study the mind. Over decades, the extreme edges of competing schools, from structuralism to psychoanalysis to behaviorism, either fell away or evolved. They eventually merged with modern fields like neuroscience and cognitive science. Achieving true scientific rigor didn't require finding one single perfect method. It required combining multiple flawed methods into a single comprehensive discipline, which is why the formal definition of psychology today is the science of behavior and mental processes. This definition honors the behaviorist's demand for observing and recording physical actions, while also giving credit to the psychoanalyst's understanding of hidden, underlying thoughts and feelings. Because the human mind is infinitely complex and largely invisible, it cannot be solved with a single equation. It must be pried at from all sides.